The cabin did not appear on any official map. It stood deep within the drowned woods of the abandoned Ravens Hollow plantation, its existence whispered only by locals who feared even uttering its name after sunset. Weather-beaten boards clung to a skeletal frame, and the roof sagged like something heavy, too heavy, had once pressed down on it from above. It was a place forgotten by history, yet remembered by shadows that refused to leave. In the late 1800s, when the plantation still operated under brutal hierarchy, the landowner had ordered one enslaved family to live separately, exiled from the rest. The man was called Isaac, his wife Martha, and their young daughter Evelyn. They were forced into the remote cabin under the claim that discipline required isolation. But rumors suggested a darker truth, that strange events had already been occurring in that building long before the family arrived. Some said the cabin predated the plantation itself, built by settlers who vanished without explanation. Others believed it marked the site of a ritual older than the nation, a place where the forest itself listened on the night the family disappeared. No storm raged, no revolt stirred, no warning was given. One evening they were seen working by the fields. The next, the cabin stood silent with its door wide open and their belongings untouched. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of escape. They simply ceased to exist by the early 1900s. When the plantation had rotted into a relic of cruelty, the cabin still stood with unsettling resilience. Explorers and historians visited the grounds, hoping to understand the disappearance. None stayed long. The first documented visitor, a historian named Edgar Walsh, arrived at the site during a gray winter morning. The forest was unnervingly still. Even the wind refused to rustle the branches, as though nature itself feared disturbing whatever lingered within those walls. Edgar noted how the cabin felt wrong. Too cold, too heavy, as if its wooden frame contained not air but something dense and unseen. When he stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned not under his weight, but as though they recognized him. The moment he pushed the door open, a thin, metallic smell drifted out, rust or old iron, mingled with something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. His lantern flickered although no wind touched it. Inside, dust carpeted every surface except one, the dining table. 3 distinct places were set with wooden bowls filled with hardened black residue. Isaac, Martha, and Evelyn had eaten here. The air tightened around Edgar as he approached the table. The chairs, 3 of them, were positioned unnaturally straight, facing the center as if the family had been preparing for something, or awaiting something. That Edgar's candlelight trembled across the walls, revealing carvings, deep, frantic etchings scratched into the wood. Symbols he did not recognize, repeated in spirals and chaotic patterns that grew sharper and more violent near the back corner of the cabin. Curves intersected with jagged lines, like someone had tried to communicate a message with shaking, desperate hands. The corner itself was the coldest part of the room. Edgar exhaled, and his breath drifted in a thin white cloud, unnatural for the mild February weather. As he leaned closer to inspect the carvings, he noticed a small object lodged between 2 planks. A child's hair ribbon, faded blue, tied neatly, as though placed there intentionally. Behind him, something shifted. He turned sharply, heart pounding. The cabin was empty, but the temperature dropped again, so sharply that his lantern's flame twisted sideways, almost extinguished by a breath he could not feel. The floor creaked. A slow, deliberate sound. Edgar stepped back, and his foot landed in something damp. He lifted his boot. Trailing behind him was a small, wet footprint. Bare, child-sized, fresh. He dropped the ribbon. The footprint led toward the cellar door, which should not have existed. According to every map, every drawing, every record of the cabin, there had never been a cellar. Yet a trapdoor sat at the center of the floor, outlined by long, dark stains that seeped from the edges like ink bleeding through paper. The historian froze, breath shaking. The lantern flickered again, then steadied only when he forced himself to step away from the cellar. Something in his chest urged him not to open it, not to even approach it. The shadows around it felt thick, viscous, as if clinging to the wood. Still, he knelt to inspect the latch point. 3 taps echoed from beneath the floor. Slow, measured, impossible. Edgar scrambled to his feet. The tapping came again. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 sharp ones. A pattern, a message. Someone, or something, was beneath the cabin. And then, from the direction of the back corner, where the carvings pulsed with eerie depth, Edgar heard breathing. A faint, trembling inhale. A soft exhale. Childlike. Fragile. Terrifying that he raised the lantern. A shadow crouched in the corner. It did not match any visible shape. No furniture stood there. No figure occupied the space. Yet the shadow curled upward like a contorted silhouette, limbs elongated, head tilted in a way no human could mirror. The shadow moved, stretching slowly as if waking from a long sleep. Edgar stumbled backward. The lantern slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor, plunging the cabin into near darkness. Only a thin line of daylight squeezed through the cracks in the boards. In that dimness, Edgar saw it. A handprint forming on the wall. Small at first, then expanding, stretching, fingers lengthening like blackened roots seeking escape. That was all the historian needed. He bolted from the cabin, running until his lungs burned and the forest behind him dissolved into distant, unnatural silence. He never returned. His written account ended with a final line: the family did not leave, and the cabin does not sleep. In the decades that followed, others who ventured near the cabin reported similar phenomena. Footsteps inside despite the emptiness, the tapping beneath the floor, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched by something ancient, patient, and aware. To this day, the cabin still stands. To this day, the trapdoor remains sealed, and to this day, after nightfall, the pattern of knocks continues. 3 slow taps, a pause. 2 quick ones, always the same, always calling. Long after Edgar Walsh fled the cabin, the land surrounding Ravens Hollow Plantation continued to rot in silence. For years, no one dared to approach the place. The cabin became a forbidden landmark, spoken of in taverns, sketched nervously in journals, and feared by anyone who valued their sanity. But as decades passed and old horrors faded into rumor, curiosity once again lured the living toward the forgotten structure. One such visitor was Jonathan Hale, a surveyor sent in the early 1900s to assess abandoned properties in the region. Officially, he was tasked with documenting land boundaries. Unofficially, he was drawn by the chilling whispers about the enslaved family who had vanished without a trace. Jonathan was a skeptic, a man of science who dismissed tales of ghosts as foolish superstition. But as he approached Raven's Hollow, reason began to falter. Even before reaching the cabin, he felt it, a vibration beneath the soil. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing deep in the earth. The trees leaned inward unnaturally, their branches twisted toward the structure as though pointing at the source of a long-buried truth. Jonathan paused, unnerved but determined. When he reached the cabin, the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The wooden boards looked even older than described in Edgar's writings. But something else troubled him. The cabin appeared tense. Its structure seemed coiled, as though bracing for something. The atmosphere pressed against Jonathan's chest with a heaviness that made every breath feel stolen as he stepped onto the porch. The boards, cold as stone, trembled faintly under his boots. Jonathan pushed open the door. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything was wrong. Dust hung in the air like suspended mist. The child-sized footprint Edgar mentioned still stained the floor, unnervingly fresh, as if time ignored it. The ribbon remained wedged between the wall planks, blue but darker now, as though soaked in shadow. But the cellar door, it no longer sat flush with the floor. It was slightly open, barely an inch, but enough to reveal darkness beneath. Jonathan froze. He hadn't touched it. No one should have touched it. And still, there it was, a thin, silent invitation to whatever lay below. He knelt beside it, his lantern flickering with frantic life. A cold draft rose from the gap, smelling faintly of wet soil and something older, something stale, metallic, and unnatural. Jonathan swallowed hard and lifted the trapdoor. The hinges did not creak. They sighed. The cellar below was swallowed in darkness thick enough to feel. The lantern illuminated only the top few steps before light thinned into nothingness. But the moment the trapdoor was fully open, the tapping began. 3 slow taps. A pause, 2 sharp ones. Jonathan flinched. The sound came from far below, echoing upward through the hollow chamber. He leaned forward, trying to listen closer, but the pattern repeated, slower this time, more deliberate, as though aware of his presence. Then came another sound. A whisper, faint, breathless, fragile. A child's voice. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. He knew he should run. Every instinct screamed at him to close the trapdoor and never return. But the whisper drifted upward again, this time clearer, soft, trembling, calling, help. The single word echoed through the dark like a plea trapped between worlds. Jonathan steadied himself and descended the first step. Then another. The wooden stairs groaned beneath him, the air growing colder with every inch. His lantern fought against the abyss, casting quivering shadows along the stone walls. Halfway down, he noticed the carvings, the same spiraling symbols from the upper walls, but deeper here, gouged violently into the stone with impossible precision. Some lines were fresh, edges sharp as if cut moments earlier. Others overlapped in violent layers, making the walls look scarred rather than decorated. Jonathan touched one of the carvings. The stone pulsed beneath his fingertips. He recoiled instantly. His lantern flickered, dimmed, and then flared so bright that shadows danced wildly around him. He reached the bottom step. The cellar was small, barely larger than a storage room. But its floor was disturbed. Mud churned as though something had crawled, dragged, or writhed across it. In the center lay a wooden chair, overturned. Ropes, frayed and stained dark, lay beside it. Jonathan's throat tightened. Someone had been held here. Recently. The whisper came again, directly behind him. Please. Jonathan spun around. Nothing. Only shadows crawling along the walls. He lifted the lantern higher. A shape stood in the far corner. Small, motionless, child-sized. The figure did not move, did not breathe. It simply stood there, darkness wrapped around it like a shroud. The lantern's light stretched across the room, catching the faint outline of a dress. A child's dress, old, torn, and a ribbon, a blue ribbon, knotted in the hair. Jonathan's shaking hand raised the lantern further, revealing the figure's face. There was no face, not anymore, just a hollow void where features should have been, like darkness had carved away identity and left only an empty silhouette. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying him. Jonathan stumbled back, tripping over the muddy ground. The lantern nearly slipped from his grip. Then the tapping began again, but this time, not from the floor, from the walls, soft at first, then louder. Dozens of tapping points, hundreds, surrounding him, encircling him. As though something hidden inside the stone was waking, the figure stepped forward without moving its legs, gliding, drawn toward him as though pulled by gravity itself. Jonathan bolted for the stairs, scrambling upward, but the darkness rushed behind him, swallowing what little light remained. He burst through the trapdoor and slammed it shut. The cabin absorbed the thud with eerie silence. Jonathan stumbled out into the forest, lungs seizing, heart pounding like a war drum. The moment he reached the clearing, the cabin door slammed behind him with violent force. He turned. The windows were no longer empty. Something watched him from inside. Something tall, something wrong, something very much awake. Jonathan fled the plantation and never spoke of what he saw. But he left behind his notebook, and in it, a final line written in shaking handwriting. There is more than one presence in the cabin. The child is not the one tapping. For nearly 2 decades after Jonathan Hale's terrifying escape, the Ravens Hollow plantation remained untouched. Locals avoided the land entirely, refusing to hunt, farm, or even travel on the old road that passed near the woods. Strange lights were occasionally reported at night, dim, flickering glows drifting between the trees, vanishing the moment anyone tried to approach. Travelers claimed to hear voices in the wind, murmurs too faint to decipher, yet too human to ignore. But the story did not fade. It grew. In 1919, after the plantation was absorbed into a new county district, all abandoned structures were ordered to be cataloged before demolition, including the cabin. No one wanted the assignment, but it eventually fell to Eleanor Graves, a young archivist renowned for her precise documentation and unshakable resolve. Eleanor, unlike most, believed in logic. Superstition, in her eyes, was simply fear wrapped in imagination. Her task was simple: enter the cabin, photograph its interior, retrieve any historical objects, complete a final report. But nothing on her assignment list prepared her for what she would discover. Eleanor arrived at the plantation on a brittle autumn morning. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and the air tasted of rain and rust. She stepped through the overgrown path leading to the cabin, noting how the forest pressed inward like a living cage. The silence was suffocating. No insects, no birds, not even the whisper of wind. When she reached the cabin, the first thing she noticed was the door. It was open. Not cracked, not forced, fully open, as though waiting for her. Inside, dust swirled through the stale air, each particle suspended like a frozen memory. Eleanor stepped over the threshold, boots creaking on the warped boards. Her camera hung from her neck, clicking faintly as its metal frame trembled with the cold. She scanned the room. The ribbon on the wall remained. The table and chairs remained. The footprint remained. But the trapdoor, it was sealed again, perfectly aligned with the floor. Not even a sliver of darkness peeked through. Eleanor exhaled slowly, though her breath felt heavier than expected. She moved toward the old cabinet near the back wall, hoping to find ledgers or documents left behind by the plantation owners. The cabinet door resisted at first, then opened with a brittle snap. Inside were papers, curled with age, mostly receipts, crop logs, and lists of the enslaved. But at the very bottom lay something untouched by dust: a leather-bound book. The cover was marked with the same spiraling carvings seen in the cabin and cellar. Eleanor hesitated. No official ledger would carry such symbols. Still, she carefully lifted the book, surprised by its weight. The leather was cold under her fingertips, unnaturally cold, like it had been buried in ice. She opened it, her breath caught. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, not by the plantation owners, but by someone else entirely. The handwriting was frantic, letters carved aggressively into the paper. Some lines were repeated dozens of times, each more violent than the last. One repeated sentence dominated several pages. "They are not allowed to leave." Eleanor flipped forward. More frantic entries, more desperate scrawls. Then she reached a page written in a steadier hand. Neater, almost calm. The ink was darker, fresher somehow. "The cabin listens. The walls remember. The floor breathes." Another line. "The child is not alone down there." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She turned another page. This one contained a drawing, shaky, uneven, but unmistakably human. It depicted the cabin. Beneath it, a dark pit. And within the pit, several figures twisted together, faceless, bound to the earth like roots. But at the top of the drawing, one figure stood taller than the rest, elongated, distorted. Watching that, a chill crawled up Eleanor's spine. She turned one more page. There was only a single word written in the center: awakened. Suddenly, something creaked. Eleanor froze. The trapdoor, the one that had been sealed, shifted, just a hair, barely noticeable, but enough to release the faintest breath of cold air. Then came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. Point three slow taps from beneath the floorboards. A pause. Point two quick ones. Eleanor stepped backward, pulse racing. She forced herself to stay rational, but the room seemed to shrink around her. The air thickened, pressing against her ribs. The tapping repeated, louder this time. She tried to leave, but the moment she reached the doorway, her camera flashed without being touched. The sudden burst of light illuminated the cabin in a blinding white glare, and something stood behind her, a tall silhouette in the corner. Unmoving. Watching, the flash faded. The figure was gone, but the air still pulsed heavy with presence. Eleanor's trembling hands lifted the camera. She checked the photograph. Her breath stopped, eyeing the captured image. The cabin's interior was distorted, warped as though the walls were bending inward. But the most horrifying detail was the trapdoor. It was wide open in the photograph, and at the bottom of the stairs, a hand reached upward, small, child-sized, covered in black mud. Eleanor staggered backward, nearly dropping the ledger. But then she noticed something else. The photo had a timestamp from 10 minutes before she even entered the cabin. Her heart hammered. She turned toward the open doorway, but the door was no longer open. It had closed silently behind her. And then, from beneath the floor, a whisper drifted upward, soft, trembling, unmistakably close. Do not look behind you. Eleanor's breath froze in her throat. She felt it, something standing inches behind her, tall, breathing slowly, patiently. The cabin seemed to lean inward, waiting for her to turn. The lantern on the wall flickered once, twice, and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The cabin swallowed Eleanor Graves in complete blackness. No moonlight seeped through the cracks. No breeze drifted through the warped boards. Even the dust seemed frozen in the air, suspended in the suffocating silence. Eleanor forced herself to breathe, shallow and controlled, though her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. The ledger still trembled in her hand. The darkness behind her felt alive, like warm breath creeping toward her neck. She didn't dare turn around, not after the whisper, not after hearing, "Do not look behind you." Her instincts screamed to run, to claw her way out through the boarded windows if necessary, but her body refused to move. Something unseen seemed to anchor her in place. It wasn't a physical force, it was something deeper, a pressure in her mind, a sensation like a hand wrapped around her thoughts, warning her, taunting her, waiting. Finally, she spoke into the darkness, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Who is there?" Nothing answered, only the faint sound of shifting wood, as though the walls had exhaled. Eleanor reached slowly for the lantern hanging on the wall. Her fingers brushed the metal frame. It was ice cold, colder than anything in the room should have been. She tightened her grip and flicked the striker. The lantern sputtered. Once, twice, a sharp metallic click. Then the flame caught, weak but steady. The cabin emerged from the shadows inch by inch. The first thing she saw was the trapdoor. It was open again. Its yawning darkness stretched like a mouth carved into the floor, pulsing with a faint, unnatural cold. The staircase leading downward was visible for only a few steps before dissolving into black. The second thing she saw nearly made her drop the lantern. Mud. Thick, wet mud smeared across the floorboards. Tracks led from the trapdoor toward the corner. small footprints, and much larger ones. Both sets recently made. Eleanor's breath tightened. She lifted the lantern higher. A tall shape stood in the corner, motionless, bent slightly forward, its limbs unnaturally long, like branches warped by a storm. Who? Who are you? Eleanor whispered. The figure did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. It simply existed in the shadow, its form trembling slightly as if the lantern's light burned its outline. Then, slowly, it tilted its head. The sound of the movement was wrong. Not a simple shift of bone and muscle, but a deep, wet crack, like old timber snapping under pressure. Eleanor stumbled back, gripping the ledger to her chest. Her lantern flickered violently. For a split second, the figure vanished and reappeared closer, much closer. Now she could see its outline more clearly. A body stretched beyond human proportions, arms too long, neck twisted in unnatural angles, an impression of a face, but not a face. A hollow. A void. A shape where features should be, but weren't. Eleanor's breath shuddered. Her voice cracked. Stay back. The thing didn't react to her words. Instead, it pointed, slowly, toward the ledger she held. The gesture was deliberate, almost patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to open the book. Eleanor hesitated, then flipped to the page with the drawing of the cabin. The figure in the corner twitched violently. The walls groaned. The floor trembled. A low, guttural moan seemed to rise from beneath the earth. Something was waking. Eleanor turned another page, a blank one. But the moment her eyes touched it, ink began to bloom across the paper. Lines appeared by themselves, rising from the page like bleeding shadows. Words formed. Do not look at him. Eleanor's heart stopped. Another word emerged, slow, scratched, final, run. The lantern flared, the flames stretching unnaturally tall, illuminating the entire cabin. And Eleanor saw something she would never forget. More figures, dozens, pressed against the walls, against the ceiling, against the floorboards beneath her feet. Shadows shaped like people, but wrong, their limbs twisted, their faces hollow, their bodies fused to the wood like trapped souls trying to claw their way out. The trapdoor slammed shut with explosive force. The cabin roared. Eleanor screamed. She bolted toward the front door and rammed her shoulder into it. But it didn't budge. Behind her, the tall figure moved, slowly at first, then faster. Its limbs contorted as it approached. Eleanor hit the door again, and it burst open so violently that she fell out into the dirt. The forest had changed. The trees leaned inward, forming a tunnel of twisting branches. The sky was gone, swallowed by a black canopy. The air felt thick with whispers, each one tugging at her mind. The cabin door slammed behind her. She scrambled up and ran. Branches clawed at her hair. Mud sucked at her boots. The forest distorted around her, every direction warping into a labyrinth. Then she heard it again, from deep within the woods, from the earth, from everywhere. Tap, tap, tap. Point three slow taps. A pause. Point two sharp ones. The tapping grew louder, closer. Then a voice whispered right next to her ear, a voice she recognized instantly from the ledger. You opened it. Eleanor froze. Something stood in front of her. Tall, silent, waiting. It stepped forward, and the trees behind her slammed shut, trapping her with it. The lantern flickered out. Darkness claimed the forest, and then something touched her shoulder. The night settled over the woodland like a shroud of ink, and the forgotten cabin, now nothing more than a ribcage of charred beams and collapsed walls, seemed to exhale a low, dreadful breath as Thomas stepped closer. The air around the ruin was unnaturally still, as though the forest itself had paused, watching him with 1,000 unseen eyes. Even the wind refused to stir. Even the insects had gone silent. Thomas had come alone. He had not told Garrett. He had not told anyone. The sheriff's warnings echoed in his mind, warnings about the land, about the cabin, about what had been buried and what should remain undisturbed. But he pushed them aside. Something in the sheriff's voice had been too controlled, too restrained. as if he knew more than he dared admit. And Thomas was not the type to turn away from a mystery that gripped him with this level of choking intensity. The moon illuminated the burnt remains with a pale, ghostly glow. The soil around the cabin was still blackened from whatever inferno had devoured it decades earlier, and yet the surrounding trees showed no scars. No singed bark, no scorched branches. The fire had consumed only the cabin, as though it had been targeted with surgical intention. As though something had wanted it erased, Thomas crouched near a partially collapsed corner beam, running his fingers through the dirt. He expected soot, but instead his fingertips brushed something harder, something brittle. He froze. Not wood, not stone, boned out a jagged piece of rib, blackened by fire, but unmistakably human. That Thomas's heart hammered as he brushed away more of the ash. Another bone, then another, and beneath them, fragments of metal shackles fused together as if melted by impossible heat. He swallowed hard. Every report, every old legend, every whispered rumor he'd read or heard had suggested that the enslaved family living in this cabin had vanished without a trace. But that had been a lie. Someone had hidden the truth beneath the ashes and time. But then he paused. These shackles, they were twisted, warped, as though they hadn't melted from outside heat, but from something within them. Something that had burst outward. Thomas stood quickly, breath shallow, his pulse stumbling. Something was wrong. Something more than fire, more than murder, more than brutality. Something unnatural. A faint whisper curled behind him. Not a word. Not human. Just movement. Soft. Measured, like something dragging itself across the ruined floorboards. Thomas turned sharply, lantern raised high. But there was nothing. Only blackened timbers and empty space. He waited, straining to hear the whisper again. Silence. But the silence felt alive. He took a step deeper into the remains, lantern shaking slightly in his hand. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice breaking the suffocating stillness. No answer. But beneath his feet, the ground felt softer, as though something hollow lay beneath the surface. Something hidden. He knelt again, this time digging with urgency. His fingers scraped against wood, but not burnt wood, fresh wood. Smooth, untouched by flame. A buried floor panel. A sealed panel. He hesitated, breath fogging in the chilly air, then wedged his fingers beneath the edge and pulled. The wood groaned softly, as if protesting after decades of forced silence. The panel gave way with a long, splintering crack, and a wave of icy air surged upward, extinguishing the edges of his lantern flame. He coughed and leaned over the opening. Inside was a narrow drop, no more than 4 feet deep, and lying at the bottom was a leather-bound journal. Intact, untouched by fire, time, or decay. The leather was pristine, not even dust-covered, as if someone, or something, had placed it there moments ago. His breath caught as he reached in, fingertips brushing the cool leather. But the moment he touched it, a tremor rippled through the ground. The cabin remains shuddered violently. Ash poured from the tilted beams overhead. The lantern flickered, and then a low, guttural hum seeped upward from the earth beneath the entire cabin. It was not the sound of wind, or animals, or shifting debris. It was something far deeper. A vibration that rattled bones. A moan from the land itself. Thomas stumbled backward, panic rising in his throat. The journal lay exposed, its cover pulsing subtly, almost like a heartbeat. The hum grew louder, then unbearable. He clapped his hands over his ears, teeth clenched, eyes watering. But even through the ringing agony, he forced himself forward, grabbed the journal, and scrambled out of the ruin. The moment his boots hit the untouched soil outside the cabin's foundation line, the sound stopped immediately, as if cut by an unseen blade. Thomas staggered away, chest heaving. The forest's unnatural silence returned, thick and oppressive. He clutched the journal against his coat, its surface still faintly warm beneath his fingers. He looked back at the ruin. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing hummed. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the ashes was now awake, something that had waited decades, something that had listened, something that had felt his touch. Thomas swallowed hard, glancing down at the journal in his hands. No title, no inscription, only a faint, almost imperceptible symbol burned into the leather. 3 interlocking crescents. He had no idea what it meant, but someone in this land had once known. Someone had hidden it, and someone had insured the cabin. And the truth burned that he exhaled shakily, and then froze. From deep within the ruined cabin came a single, sharp sound that a knock. Knocked, as if something or someone trapped below the ashes had just realized the door was open. Thomas did not return to town that night. His instinct warned him that stepping back into civilization with the journal in hand, before knowing what it contained, would be a mistake, maybe even a fatal one. So instead, he wandered deeper into the woods, lantern flickering at his side, until he found a dry clearing far away from the cabin's suffocating silence. The journal felt heavier with every step he took. Not physically, its weight was ordinary, but in his mind, the thing had a gravity that pulled at him, as though the book demanded to be opened, to be read, to finally speak after more than a century of being buried alive. He sat on a fallen log, lantern beside him, breath forming pale clouds in the chilled night air. The forest remained quiet, eerily quiet, as though every living thing had retreated or fled the moment he uncovered the journal. Thomas exhaled and placed the leather-bound volume on his lap. The symbol of the three interlocking crescents shimmered faintly under the lantern's glow, almost as though absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then, with a slow, determined motion, he opened the cover. The first page was blank, the second page too, but on the third, ink appeared. Dark, spidery strokes that seemed to crawl across the page as if freshly written. Thomas leaned closer, heart thudding. The handwriting belonged to someone who had been frightened. The letters shook. Some slashed across the page with frantic force. And at the top, just one line. If you are reading this, then the land did not keep its promise. Thomas felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck as he continued. The entry was dated October 3rd, 1884, that the writer described the enslaved family, though never by name, only by initials, as people who had begun hearing the hum beneath the earth, a sound that had followed them, growing louder each night until sleep became impossible. They had spoken of shadows appearing in the corners of the cabin, shadows without sources, shadows that existed even in bright daylight. Then the writer explained something else, something far worse. Someone had visited them. Not a person, a figure, tall, thin, and featureless, its outline barely human, emerging at night from the tree line and standing outside the cabin without moving. Sometimes for hours, sometimes until dawn. Each night it drew closer. Each night it lingered longer, and the hum grew stronger whenever it appeared. The journal pages trembled slightly in Thomas's hands, or perhaps his own fingers were trembling too hard to tell the difference. The next entry described how the family had begged the overseer for permission to leave the cabin and move somewhere safer. They claimed the thing in the woods whispered to their children, promising freedom, promising escape, promising an end to suffering, but only if they followed it into the trees, into the darkness, into the humming ground. Thomas clenched the pages, breath tightening. The overseer refused. He believed the family was making excuses, trying to escape work. He dismissed the sightings, dismissed the sounds, dismissed the terror in their eyes. And then, the journal revealed something Thomas did not expect. The overseer wasn't writing these entries, a different hand wrote them. Someone who believed the family, someone who tried to help them, someone who tried to warn them. The writer described sneaking food to the family at night, staying close enough to the cabin's porch to speak without waking the overseer. They wrote about how the family had grown pale, shadows beneath their eyes deepening, voices dropping to whispers even when nothing stood near them. They feared the cabin itself had begun listening, creaking at moments when no one moved, shifting as though something inside the walls was trying to breathe. On October 21st, the writer claimed the hum had become so loud it rattled plates and tools hanging on the cabin walls. And then came the final complete entry. Tonight they are leaving. They pack what little they have. But something is angry. The ground trembles. The air tastes like iron. The children cry at shadows that none of us can see. I fear they waited too long. I fear the forest will not let them pass. If they do not return by dawn, I will bury this journal. This history must not be forgotten. The truth must one day come out. The next page was half filled, the handwriting chaotic, letters overlapping .as though written while the writer was running or being chased. It came from beneath. The cabin split open, the screams. The fire wasn't fire. They were pulled. The ink suddenly slashed violently downward, cutting through the page as if the writer's hand had been yanked mid-stroke. The rest of the page was a smear of panic. The following pages were blank, dozens of them. White, empty, silent. Thomas stared at them, throat dry. He closed the journal slowly, fingers brushing the raised crescent symbol. Then something odd caught his eye. The blank pages toward the back of the journal weren't perfectly blank. Under the lantern's dim light, faint impressions appeared, indentations left by a hand pressing too hard, as though the writer had tried to write more but had no ink left. Thomas angled the book, narrowing his eyes. Yes, there were words, invisible ink impressions, the message carved into the paper. Through sheer force of desperation, he lifted the lantern higher and squinted. The indentations formed a single sentence, a warning, a location, a command. Thomas's breath seized as the meaning became clear. But before he could react, a twig snapped directly behind him. Not far. Not accidental, as though someone, or something, had been standing in the darkness, waiting for him to finish. Reading, he turned slowly, lantern trembling, and saw a shape between the trees, tall, thin, unmoving, exactly as described in the journal, exactly where the writer said it would return. For a long, paralyzing moment, Thomas could not move. The figure standing among the trees did not shift, did not breathe, did not sway with the wind. It stood perfectly still, so still that if not for its unnatural height, he might have mistaken it for a dead trunk. But this thing was no tree. The lantern's flame quivered as Thomas raised it higher, the trembling glow stretching across the underbrush until it caught the edges of the figure's silhouette. It towered above the forest floor, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in ways that violated every rule of anatomy. The outline of its shoulders sloped downward like wilted branches, and its head, featureless, pale, smooth, tilted slightly, as though studying him with eyes it did not possess. Thomas's breath hitched. The journal lay open on his lap, pages rustling in the faint breeze. Yet the figure's presence seemed to swallow even the air itself. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. Fear pinned him in place like rusted shackles. Slowly, the figure lifted one arm, not with speed, not with aggression, but with the dreadful grace of something that had all the time in the world. Its arm extended outward, stretching farther than any human limb should, and pointed directly at the journal resting on Thomas's knees. Thomas swallowed hard, throat constricting. "You want this?" he whispered. Though his voice was barely more than a broken rasp, the figure tilted its head again, as if confused by his attempt to speak, or perhaps amused. A faint hum, deep, resonant, bone-shaking, vibrated through the soil beneath him, the same ancient sound he had heard beneath the cabin ashes. It pulsed outward like the slow heartbeat of something buried beneath the earth. Thomas clutched the journal tighter, and the moment he did, the hum changed. It grew sharper, higher, almost like a warning, almost like a threat. The lantern's flames stretched unnaturally tall for a second, then shrank abruptly as if gasping for air. The figure stepped forward at a single, long, deliberate step. The ground seemed to sink beneath its weight, although its body was so thin it looked incapable of displacing even a leaf. Another step, and another. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, still a good distance away, but now its form was clearer. Too clear. The surface of its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale like frostbitten flesh, yet smooth like polished stone. And where a face should have been, there was only a slight concavity, As though the features had been erased from existence, Thomas forced himself to speak. If you can understand me, what happened to them? The family? Did you take them? Did you cause the fire? The figure did not react, but the forest around them did. Branches trembled, leaves shivered, and the hum rose again, vibrating through Thomas's bones. The figure lifted its arm once more. This time, it didn't point at the journal that it pointed past Thomas. Over his shoulder, something behind him. Thomas froze, very slowly. Against every screaming instinct, he turned his head. The shadows in the woods had thickened behind him, as though gathering, as though forming shapes. Small shapes, four of them, child-sized shapes. They stood in a row, silhouettes carved out of darkness, unmoving but unmistakably present. He couldn't see their faces, just outlines, but their heads were tilted upward, all of them fixated on him with a stillness that felt wrong, ancient, and impossibly sad. That Thomas's skin crawled. The children did not step forward. They did not speak. They only stood there, waiting. A gust of icy wind tore through the clearing, snuffing Thomas's lantern flame completely. Darkness swallowed everything except the faint moonlight that slipped through the trees. His heart hammered as he clutched the journal, the symbol on the cover warm against his palm. As if pulsing, he backed away a step. The children didn't move. He backed away another. The tall figure didn't move. Then the journal snapped open in his hands, pages flipping wildly, as though an unseen force was rifling through them, until it landed on the final indented sentence that Thomas had deciphered only moments before. Lit faintly by the moon, the carved words seemed to glow deeper into the page now, as if alive. Do not trust the ones who came after. Thomas's breath faltered. The ones who came after. The overseers? The townspeople? The men who investigated the cabin? The sheriff? No. The wording was too deliberate, too precise, too terrified. Whoever wrote this wasn't warning about what happened back then. They were warning about something happening now. Suddenly, a new sound echoed through the trees. Boots. Heavy. Urgent. Getting closer. Thomas. A voice shouted from somewhere beyond the trailing. Thomas, are you out here? Thomas stiffened. It was Garrett's voice. But something about the tone, something cold, sharp, unfamiliar, made the blood in his veins freeze. He turned back toward the clearing. The tall figure had vanished, the shadow children too. The hum stopped instantly, sucked out of the air like breath extinguished. Only the journal remained, heavy in his trembling hands. Garrett's footsteps drew nearer, closer, too close. Thomas took a step back. Every instinct, every warning in the journal, every tremor in the ground screamed the same thing. Do not trust him. Thomas, Garrett called again, closer now, but somehow his voice felt wrong. Empty, like someone wearing a familiar voice as a mask. That Thomas's heart thudded painfully. He stared at the dark tree where Garrett approached, then at the journal, then back at the spot where the tall figure had stood moments ago, and a horrifying realization struck him. What if the journal's warning wasn't about the past? What if it was about who was coming for him right now? The forest swallowed Garrett's footsteps, muffling them into a soft, rhythmic crunch, too steady, too measured, like someone imitating the sound rather than making it. Thomas clutched the journal to his chest and stepped backward, eyes scanning the shifting darkness between the trees. Thomas, Garrett called again, voice calm, even casual. It's freezing out here. What in God's name are you doing this far from town? Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Garrett sounded like Garrett, but only sounded like him. The cadence was familiar, but the emotion was gone, stripped out, hollowed. His voice carried nothing underneath, no warmth, no irritation, no concern, just emptiness. Thomas raised his lantern, trying to coax flame back into it, but the wick refused to catch. The cold around him had thickened into something unnatural, something suffocating. His breath hovered like fog, barely drifting before dissolving into the air. A twig cracked behind him. Thomas spun around. Nothing. No children, no tall figure, no whispering hum beneath the soil. The forest looked normal again. Too normal. Thomas, I see your light, Garrett said from behind a row of pines. Stay where you are. Thomas didn't move. The journal's leather cover throbbed faintly beneath his fingers, like a pulse. The message carved into its pages echoed in his mind. Do not trust the ones who came after. He swallowed hard. Garrett stepped into view at a first glance. He looked completely normal. Same coat, same boots, same face. His expression carried a calm concern that would have comforted anyone else who didn't know what Thomas had just witnessed. But Thomas noticed something subtle, something small but suffocating. Garrett wasn't breathing in rising chest, in fog of exhaled breath in the icy night air. Nothing. Garrett approached with steady steps, eyes fixed on Thomas, unblinking. The forest seemed to bend around him, shadows leaning back as though refusing to touch him. You're pale, Garrett said softly. Did something scare you out here? Thomas tightened his grip on the journal. Stay where you are, he managed to force out. Garrett stopped. Not because he was startled, not because he was confused, but because Thomas told him to if the request amused him. Why? Garrett asked, head tilting in a way that didn't match human movement. Too slow, too smooth. You think I'm here to hurt you? Thomas took one step back. Garrett took one step forward. Perfectly matched, perfectly mirrored. Thomas, he said, but this time the voice sharpened, slipping out of cadence, like someone adjusting controls behind a curtain. Come now. Let's not do anything foolish. The words were wrong. The tone was wrong. The man was wrong. Thomas felt the earth rumble faintly beneath his boots. Not enough to shake him. Just enough to let him know the humming thing beneath the forest floor was not gone. It was listening, waiting, and reacting to Garrett's presence. Where did you find it? Garrett asked suddenly. Thomas stiffened. Find what? Garrett's eyes flicked downward to the journal tucked beneath Thomas's arm. Too fast, too precise, as if following an invisible line rather than looking with human awareness. That, Garrett said quietly. Give it to me. The forest groaned, trees straining as though the roots themselves recoiled. Thomas shook his head, panic rising in his throat. Why do you want it? Garrett's jaw twitched, and for a split second, just a heartbeat, his face rippled, like something beneath the skin was adjusting, positioning itself, aligning the mask. Thomas stumbled back. Garrett smiled a wrong smile, a smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that looked human but felt borrowed. You shouldn't have come here alone, he whispered. That Thomas's pulse thundered. What happened to you? He asked, voice trembling. What are you? Garrett blinked slowly, and when his eyelids parted again, his pupils had vanished, leaving two pale, glass-like orbs, not eyes, windows into something else looking through him. I came after, Garrett said, voice splitting into layered tones. One human, others deeper, older, echoing from beneath the ground. And now so will you. The earth beneath Thomas shuddered hard, cracking like brittle ice. A deep rumble surged up through the soil, the same hum he had heard at the cabin ashes, but this time it wasn't dormant. It was rising. Thomas whirled and sprinted into the trees as the ground behind him erupted in a violent surge of dark soil and splintered roots. Something huge moved beneath the surface, following his footsteps with terrifying speed, cracking the earth open in serpentine patterns. That Garrett's voice echoed behind him. Thomas, you can't outrun what the land has chosen. Thomas crashed through vines, branches, and fallen logs, breath burning in his lungs, the journal thumping against his ribs. The forest felt endless, shifting, leading him somewhere he did not choose to go. He stopped only when he reached a clearing, a perfect circle of untouched ground, surrounded by dense, ancient trees. A place that felt forbidden, sacred, wrong. Thomas's chest heaved as he looked down. Carved into the center of the clearing was the same symbol on the journal. 3 interlocking crescents. Fresh, clean. As if carved only moments ago. He stared, horrified, as the symbol began to glow with faint red light. Pulsing in rhythm with the hum rising from beneath the soil, something was waking, something was coming. Thomas, Garrett's voice murmured from the tree-line, now echoing in multiple tones. You've brought it the key it has been waiting for. Thomas backed away, but the ground beneath his heel cracked open. A hand, blackened, long-fingered, dripping earth, shot out from the ground and grabbed his ankle. Thomas screamed, but the forest swallowed the sound whole. The hand around Thomas's ankle was ice-cold, vice-strong, and nothing human. Its fingers were too long, its joints wrong, bending in angles bones should never bend. The soil around it writhed like something alive, like the earth itself was birthing whatever had taken hold of him. Thomas clawed at the ground, dragging himself away, but the hand tightened, pulling him toward the center of the carved symbol. The glowing crescents pulsing faster and faster as though recognizing him, welcoming him, claiming him. "Let go," he shouted, kicking wildly. The thing beneath the earth responded with a low groan, a groan that vibrated up his leg, through his ribs, into his skull, a groan that sounded like the cabin's last night, like the family's screams buried under flame, like something swallowing them whole. That Thomas's heartbeat spiked, the forest spinning around him. He dug his fingernails into the dirt, grasping roots, rocks, anything, desperate to anchor himself as the hand dragged him inch by inch across the ground. Behind him, Garrett stepped into the clearing. But this was not Garrett anymore. His limbs lengthened with every step, stretching like melted shadow, his neck elongated, his voice, when he spoke, echoed with layered tones, some deep and ancient, some whispering like tired children, some screaming without sound. "Do not fight it, Thomas," the thing, wearing Garrett's face, whispered. "You have already been marked. You opened what should have remained buried." Thomas kicked harder, heel striking the wrist of the hand. The grip loosened, just enough for him to yank his leg free. He scrambled back, panting, mud smeared across his hands. The journal nearly slipped from his arm, but he clutched it close, its faint warmth pulsing like a heartbeat. The glowing symbol carved into the clearing intensified, bathing the trees in sickly red light. The soil split open with a violent crack. Thomas stumbled back as something rose from beneath the forest floor, a second hand, a third, a fourth, each one clawing upward, fingers curling, dragging unseen bodies toward the surface. But they were not bodies, they were shadows, human shapes made of darkness and ash, their mouths open in silent screams. Of smoldering red, that Thomas's chest tightened. The enslaved family, their children, their shadows, trapped for more than a century, now pulled back to the surface by something older and hungrier than fire. "Why?" Thomas whispered, trembling, heart breaking and terrified at once. "Why them? Why me?" Garrett's body rippled again, his skin stretching thin like damp paper clinging to the shape beneath. "They chose to stay," the voice said. "You chose to listen, and the land chooses the curious." Thomas backed up until his shoulders hit a tree trunk. The shadow children stepped forward, their movements uneven, jittering, as if pulled by invisible strings. Their mouths hung open as if trying to speak, but no sound escaped. Thomas shook his head, tears burning his eyes. I want to help you." The clearing exploded with a blast of cold air, not wind, but breathed out a deep, ancient exhalation. The forest bowed with it, trees bending inward as though acknowledging a king rising from the soil. The hum began again, louder, hungrier, rising through Thomas's bones, threatening to crack him open. It wasn't a sound anymore, but it was a presence, a mind, a will. The earth behind the shadows split open wider, forming a yawning cavity beneath the glowing symbol. Inside that abyss, something enormous shifted, something with shape and no shape, something the shadows were drawn to like slaves chained to an unseen master. The journal in Thomas's hand seared hot. He cried out, dropping it into the dirt. The moment it hit the ground, its pages flipped violently, once, twice, until stopping on a page Thomas had never seen before. Symbols filled the page, spirals, crescents, intertwined lines that flowed like veins. Beneath them, faint handwriting bled into existence, ink rising from nothing. "If you see the hands, the soil has already chosen your place." Thomas's heart froze. Beneath the symbol, more writing appeared as if scratched into the page by invisible nails. "Run while you can. Run before it knows you are not one of them." The ground rumbled harder. Shadows surged from the crack, arms reaching, clawing, grasping for him. But then suddenly froze. Every shadow, every hand, every whisper held in place they s if paused by some unseen command. Garrett, or the thing inside him, tilted its head and said in a voice that made the trees wither, "It knows now." The soil convulsed. The shadow children bent backward unnaturally, mouths stretched open wider than bone should allow, and a monstrous presence pressed from beneath the earth. So massive Thomas felt his ribs bending inward. The trees leaned away. The symbol burned bright red. Thomas staggered back, but the thing wearing Garrett stepped forward, one elongated arm reaching for the journal. "You have brought the key," it whispered. "Now we'll take back what once belonged to it." Thomas darted forward, scooped the journal off the ground, and the moment his fingers touched it, a scream tore through the clearing. Not human, not animal, something older, something buried, something awakened. The forest plunged into pitch darkness, every tree, every root, every shadow swallowed by a single suffocating black wave. Thomas felt the ground drop beneath him, and then he fell, downward, into the crack, into the darkness that hunger had opened for him. Thomas stepped toward the cabin's threshold, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots, as if complaining to the earth itself. The air was impossibly still, unnaturally silent. No wind, no insects, no distant forest rustle. It was the kind of silence that didn't simply exist, it watched. He felt the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing against his spine. The lantern in his right hand flickered violently, then steadied, throwing trembling shadows across the ruined doorway. He inhaled sharply. The familiar, suffocating smell of rot and wet wood grew stronger. A scent he had come to associate with the cabin, a scent that felt older than the forest itself. As he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped so drastically it felt like stepping into the open mouth of a crypt. His breath clouded instantly. The cabin interior was transformed, no longer resembling the collapsing structure he glimpsed from outside. Instead, it seemed restored, not fully, but hauntingly so, as if frozen in the last minutes before the slave family vanished. The table stood upright. The chairs were aligned. The hearth glowed faintly, as though embers were clinging to life. But nothing looked natural. The restored items had a wet, pulsing sheen, as though made of something other than wood. Something alive. Thomas fought the urge to turn around and run. His instincts screamed to leave, but a stronger force, the same force that had drawn every investigator before him, pulled him deeper inside. He took another step. The floor beneath him rippled, not creaked, rippled, like water disturbed by a submerged creature slithering just beneath the surface. Thomas stumbled backward, hard hammering. The lantern whipped around, its light slicing across the walls, and what he saw rooted him to the spot. Handprints, thousands, small, trembling, frantic handprints smeared across the cabin walls, ceilings, and floor. Not painted, not carved, pressed into the material as though the wood was soft as flesh, capturing every finger, every ridge, every desperate attempt to escape. Some were tiny, belonging to children. Others were adult-sized. All of them pointed inward, toward the center of the room. Toward him. A thick, low groan rose from beneath the floorboards, vibrating through his shoes. It sounded like a sigh, or a warning, or a welcome. Thomas lifted the lantern higher, breath hitching, and the door slammed shut behind him. The bolt slid across by itself. Then the cabin inhaled. Walls expanded outward with a wet, stretching sound. The hearth pulsed. Dust lifted from the floorboards as though rising on a silent exhale. Thomas spun, banging on the door. "Open! Open it!" But the wood absorbed the impact like muscle. Each strike left no sound, only a faint tremor, as though he was hitting something alive rather than solid. A voice drifted through the cabin. Not spoken, not whispered. "Remember us." Thomas spun, lantern trembling in his grip. "Who's there? Show yourself." The walls darkened, stains spreading like ink. Slowly, the handprints began to move, dragging themselves across the surface like shifting shadows. Some slipped into the floor. Others slid toward the ceiling. They converged around the hearth, climbing it, merging into a single, enormous print, one so large it dwarfed any human hand. The cabin groaned again, longer, deeper, angrier, and from somewhere behind him, he heard chains dragging. He turned. Nothing, but the sound grew louder, closer. The lantern flickered violently, and then extinguished entirely, plunging the room into perfect, suffocating darkness. Thomas froze. "Hello?" A second voice answered, low, cold, ancient. "Turn around." Thomas shook his head in the dark. "No, no, I won't turn around." The chains clinked closer. The floor flexed under heavy, slow steps. Thomas felt warmth behind him, not the warmth of breath, but of something massive and alive exhaling stale air from a place where lungs should not exist. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Turn around." The command shook the entire cabin. Thomas slowly opened his eyes in the darkness. He turned and saw, but before his mind could even process the thing taking shape in front of him, the floor collapsed beneath him. He plunged into darkness, down into a cavern of echoing screams. Something enormous reached up, catching his leg with fingers like roots. He felt himself being pulled deeper and deeper into a tunnel of writhing shadows. He screamed, clawing at the collapsing edges. "No, no, let me go, let me go." The cabin shuddered violently as if swallowing him whole. His final cry echoed, muffled, fading. Then silence returned, but a still, eternal silence. Above ground, the cabin restored itself, the floor sealed, the walls smoothed. The door unbolted gently, creaking open as if nothing had happened. The forest wind resumed for the first time in hours, and outside, at the edge of the clearing, a new set of footprints appeared in the dirt. Thomas's footprints. Except they led into the cabin. None led out. The clearing grew quiet. Then the cabin whispered, soft, satisfied, hungry. One more. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the dense treetops, but even daylight felt thin in that part of the forest, as if the sun itself refused to fully illuminate the clearing where the cabin rested. Sheriff Alden Briggs stood at the edge of the path, breathing hard, coat dusted with frost. He had spent the entire night following the faint trail left by Thomas's markers, scraps of cloth tied to branches, bent twigs, and chalk symbols drawn on stones. But the trail ended here at the silent clearing, at the cabin he had been warned never to approach. That he swallowed hard. Every hair on his neck rose the moment his gaze touched the structure. It looked perfectly still, perfectly ordinary. But it wasn't. Something about it radiated a quiet malice, like a predator pretending to sleep. Alden stepped cautiously into the clearing. The air grew colder with each footfall. He saw Thomas's lantern lying in the dirt near the threshold, its glass cracked from impact. The flame inside was dead. Alden crouched, touching it gently with one finger. The metal was still warm, meaning Thomas had been here recently. Very recently. He stood up slowly. "Thomas, if you're in there, answer me," he called, his voice tight. Nothing answered. Not even an echo. Alden approached the door, gripping the worn handle. For a moment, he hesitated. His father had told him stories about this place, stories he dismissed in his youth as superstition. But now, standing in this suffocating silence, he felt those childhood warnings stirring inside him like old ghosts. That he pushed the door open. The hinges moaned. The interior appeared abandoned. Broken furniture, collapsed beams, rot everywhere. Dust floated lazily through beams of pale light pouring from the holes in the roof. It looked like a place untouched for decades, except on the table rested an object that absolutely should not exist. A freshly bound leather journal. Alden approached it slowly, feeling a strange pull toward it. The journal's cover was dark, almost black, and unmarked. He touched it, cold as stone. Then he opened it. The first page contained handwriting that Thomas's handwriting, shaking, uneven, desperate. Alden read, "If someone finds this, do not trust what the cabin shows you. It is alive. It watches. It wants witnesses. It wants history to bleed again." Alden's pulse quickened. He turned the page, more frantic writing. "I saw them. The family. They never left. They never died. It keeps them. It keeps everyone." He flipped to the next page, breath shallow. "The cabin changes itself, restores itself. It becomes what it needs to be. The walls remember. The floor remembers. And now it remembers me." Alden's fingers trembled. The next line was smeared, as if Thomas wrote it in panic. "I hear chains. They're coming up." The sentence ended abruptly, the pen stroke dragging off the page as though ripped from his hand. Alden shut the journal, forcing himself to steady his breathing. He scanned the cabin again. That's when he saw it. Footprints. Thomas's footprints. Alden followed them deeper inside, past the table, past the hearth, and toward the back wall. The prints were crisp, fresh, dust displaced, edges sharp, but the last two prints stopped right before the wall, directly against solid timber. Alden frowned. "What the hell?" He pressed his hand against the wall. Warm. Unnaturally warm. A faint vibration pulsed beneath the surface, like something breathing on the other side. He stepped back, heartbeat pounding. "Thomas, are you behind this wall?" Silence. Then, softly, the wood pulsed again, almost like a heartbeat responding to his voice. Alden felt sweat drip down his neck. He backed away slowly, until something under his boot cracked. He looked down. A small wooden toy lay half buried in the dust. A carved horse. Rough. Handmade. Burn marks along the side. The kind of toy a child from the 1800s might have treasured. He picked it up. The moment he did, the cabin seemed to tighten around him. The air grew heavier, thicker, colder. His breath formed a white cloud. Then he heard it. A child's whisper, right behind him. "Give it back." Alden spun around. No one. Just the doorway, open to the gray morning outside. He stumbled backward, dropping the toy. It hit the floor with a soft thud that echoed far too loudly. The whisper came again, closer, more insistent, more desperate. "Give it back." Alden backed toward the exit, heart hammering. This place is wrong," he muttered. He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut in front of him. Hard. Alden froze. Slowly, he reached for the handle, fingers shaking. It refused to move. The air behind him shifted. The walls creaked. No. Bent. Like something inside them was pushing outward. A low voice rolled through the cabin, deep as the earth itself. "You opened the record." The journal on the table snapped open by itself. Pages flipped violently, stopping at a blank sheet. Ink began forming words, slow, deliberate, crawling across the page like black veins. Alden watched in horror as a new entry wrote itself. "The cabin has chosen its next witness." Alden staggered back, chest tightening. Witness to what? The answer came from every wall, every corner, every shadow at once. Everything. The cabin groaned, timbers convulsing. Alden lunged for the window and froze. A face was pressed against the glass from the outside. Not human, not alive. Its hollow eyes stared directly at him. The glass cracked. Once, twice, a third time. And then everything went silent, dead silent. The cabin inhaled, and the window shattered. Sheriff Alden's boots crunched across the broken glass as the cold morning light bled weakly into the cabin. The shattered window spread like a jagged wound, yet the silence that followed was deeper than before. So deep it seemed to swallow even the sound of Alden's breath. Every instinct in him screamed to run, but something heavier, older, held him in place. The air behind him thickened, the floor trembled, the walls stretched again, as if the cabin's wooden skin was struggling to contain something enormous beneath it. Alden forced himself to step away from the window, toward the table where the journal lay open. Ink continued to bleed into new words, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat writing its own pulse. Do not resist. The cabin does not destroy. The cabin remembers. Alden slammed the journal shut, but the ink continued writing across the closed cover. Tight, alive, crawling like veins across flesh. He backed away. No, no, you're not real, he whispered. The cabin responded immediately. We are memory. Each word vibrated through the floorboards. Alden stumbled as the entire cabin shifted, groaning like a giant creature rotating its limbs beneath the dirt. The footprints that had belonged to Thomas began to darken, swelling, deepening, until they no longer looked like prints left by boots. They looked like impressions left by hands. Hands dragging a body. Alden's breath hitched. No. God, no. Another whisper slid across the room. This one a woman's voice, trembling with a grief buried for centuries. Do not forget us. A second voice joined out, a child's. You took our home. A third voice, low, broken, terrifyingly close. So now, we take yours. The wooden wall behind Alden bulged outward, as if something inside was pushing its face against the timber. Cracks spidered across the surface. Splinters fell. The structure tightened like a muscle contracting. Alden grabbed his revolver, aiming trembling hands at the wall. Stay back, he shouted. The cabin laughed, a deep, echoing vibration that came from everywhere and nowhere. You cannot threaten what was never alive and never dead. The bulge in the wall burst as a wave of shadow erupted, swirling into the room like a living storm. Faces appeared inside it. Faces of the slave family. Faces of all the men who had vanished here in the decades since. Faces warped by terror and something else, suffering. Alden fired. The bullet dissolved before it reached the wall. The shadows surged forward. His lantern shattered. The flames died. And the room fell into complete darkness. He felt them now. Hands, dozens of them, grabbing his arms, his coat, his throat, pulling him toward the pulsing boards, toward the breathing walls. No. And oh, let me go. But the voices whispered together. You will remember for us. A final violent shudder rocked the cabin. Alden's scream echoed. And then, nothing. Silence. A heavy, absolute silence. Minutes passed. Then the cabin exhaled. The floor smooth. The walls sealed. The journal closed by itself. The leathery cover tightening as if swallowing its own pages. Boot prints formed near the door. Alden's boot prints. They walked inside. None walked out. By midday, the forest wind returned. The birds sang again. Life continued around the clearing as if nothing had happened. But the cabin waited, its doorway open, its shadows still, its hunger quiet but awake. And on the ground beside the steps lay two items, Thomas's cracked lantern and Sherman Alden's sheriff badge, half buried in the dirt. The forest watched, the cabin watched, and deep inside its walls, where old memories lived like trapped breaths, new whispers began to form. New stories, new voices, another chapter sealed in its rotting heart. A story that would never die, because the cabin would never let it. Narrator's summary. And so, the cabin in the forgotten woods claimed yet another witness, adding Sheriff Alden's voice to the endless echoes trapped within its walls. For more than a century, every soul that entered seeking answers became part of the history they hoped to uncover. A history twisted, buried, and hungry, feeding on fear, memory, and the silence of those who vanished. Today, the cabin still stands in that remote clearing. No official map marks it, no local will guide you to it, and no investigator has ever returned with proof of what truly lives inside. But one thing is certain, the cabin never stopped watching. It never stopped remembering. And if you ever find yourself deep in those woods, listen carefully. because the moment the forest goes quiet, the cabin has already found you.